So most of the time when people think of extinction, you think of animals being hunted to death. And there's been certainly a lot of cases that have popularized that. The passenger pigeon used to be the most numerous bird in North America, and they were hunted to extinction. The dodo bird we just mentioned. So apparently birds are particularly susceptible to this. When it comes to, of course, hunting and fishing could be in that same category. There's a lot of commercial species that have been harvested to the point of at least commercial extinction and are getting, some may get close to that otherwise. But in general, that's rarely the cause of, or that is not the main cause of habitats going or species going prematurely extinct. Main thing is habitat alteration, which is most commonly referred to as habitat destruction, but this is a more correct phrase, and it's one that is used in informed circles more so. This has a double effect, by the way. Of course, organisms need the things that are in their habitat. We talked on and on about how it starts at the base with your physical, the water and the soil and all that kind of stuff. So organisms need that, of course. But the second thing that happens, now the plants are just gone when you go in, let's say, and clear out an area of the rainforest. But the animals, a lot of them are going to move. But the problem is that when they move, they're going into areas, you remember from population growth, where most of the species in that particular ecosystem that they move into are already at carrying capacity. They have already maximized their use of the resources there. So when you crowd it up with a bunch more numbers in their population and all the competition, all that kind of stuff, you not only have had loss from the area that was cleared, you're going to impact significantly the areas in which those animals and other things that can move, that area in which they move into. Okay, so that's a double thing, and that's why it has the habitat alteration has such a dramatic impact on the populations and species in general that are in those areas. Okay, so since that's the number one cause for this happening, the number one way to reduce that is by forming preserves. Okay, and we're not talking about strawberry preserves or some fruity type jam concoction. These are areas that you set aside, and ideally you say no use, no human impact whatsoever. Now, of course, you can't get that completely because you still have air and water pollution that can be transported in there no matter how tall you build the fences and stuff. But this would mean, people are not allowed to hike through there, for example. People are not allowed to hunt or fish through there. So what we see is that around the world with these different types of preserves and these different areas that are set aside for the sake of nature, is that they oftentimes have varying levels of restrictions that are put on them. And I've even mentioned how you have the Seminole State Forest over here, which is it's a managed area, but they allow logging in there and everything as long as you follow certain rules and those type of things. So from a strictly environmental perspective, yes, it'd be best if we could set aside areas and say don't do anything with it. But as I mentioned before, that's not often very practical to do. So we establish these different preserves, conservation areas, state forests, state parks. There's dozens of different designations, and they vary from country to country. So that indicate to what level people can use those particular areas. And you have to also remember that if you were to take, for example, state parks and say, all right, we're really going to go completely environmental, we're going to say nobody can use these state parks at all. That would be the best. People going, even hiking around and stuff has its impact on the environment. But how much support do you think those state parks would get from the public then? How much support would you think you would get from these different areas?
Zero.
Very little. I would say zero because you have some people that are going to say we need to do it this way. But you've got to have some type of public interest, recreational interest, or whatever it is, in order for people to appreciate and want to have it. This is one of the arguments, by the way, also for zoos. When you have animals, you might say, oh, those animals should be out in the wild. I'll tell you what, first of all, they like being in a zoo, just like we like to live in houses and go to jobs so we can buy stuff at the grocery store rather than having to hunt for everything and gather everything from the ground. We made that choice for the most part, unless it's a terrible zoo, but a modern zoo that is well maintained and everything, those animals there actually, they've got it pretty good.
They like luxury.
Yeah, they do. They get all the meals for them. They're actually even encouraged to mate with the, they don't have to fight to mate with something, they're, et cetera. So they're living pretty good there. But point being is that zoos expose people to the animals and makes people more aware of, things that need to be preserved and conservation, those kind of things. So it's been shown that they increase contributions and things to these different organizations. Speaking of which, these preserve areas may be things that governments establish. That's usually the way it's done, is through governments. But also there's a number of private organizations that are in the business of doing this. Usually when the private organizations do it, then they will go, all right, this is set aside, nobody can do anything at all with it. One particular organization, or probably the biggest organization that does this, is the Nature Conservancy. And if I may give advice, if you are looking, charitable-wise or even time volunteering-wise to work with an environmental preservation organization, the Nature Conservancy I think is one of the most effective, because rather than running boats in front of whaling ships and tying themselves to tractors and stuff like that, they just collect funds and buy properties, buy areas where there is a concern for what some would call hotspots, where there's a concern that these areas are likely to be developed, or they have a lot of endangered species, or whatever else. That's what they do. So you won't really see them in the news and stuff because they don't waste a lot of time in court and doing dramatic things. They're not going to make a reality show about them, but they are very effective at what they do. So one of the things that when you do preservations, one of the things that you have to try to do, as I've just said, you can have some development, but you want to limit as much something called fragmentation. Because there's a temptation to say, okay, let's build a road through this forest, for example. You've got a couple cities on each side, a road through 1,000 acres of forest is going to take up less than 1% probably of the actual land in that forest. Okay, but what happens is that it splits that forest. It basically goes from one ecosystem to two ecosystems. It makes an island out of it, just like the problems we saw with the islands, the actual islands that are in the ocean, kind of thing. It causes a lot of the problems there because that road is a barrier. So it isolates them and it changes the geometry of it, actually. In that, just as you can imagine, it's like a pizza, you cut it down the middle, now you have, and split it apart, now you have two half pieces, of course, but you have actually a lot more edge than you had before. Okay? In ecosystems, that edge habitat is different from the core habitat. And so you have less of that core habitat, maybe not a lot less, but you still have less of that core habitat and you have much more edge habitat. Okay? So this is a disruption of the normal ecological balance and has been shown to be quite long-reaching in its effects. So if you talk about, like I said, maybe taking up about 1% of the land, it could have the impact equivalent of just chopping out a quarter of that total ecosystem just from what it does. Some of the things that in particular are affected. Sorry, group 2, we got to go the exact opposite direction here. Are animals that have to range over long distances. This is typically top-level consumers are a prime example of that. Because of the fact that they have at the top of the ecological pyramid, they have a limited food supply, so they have to cover large distances to get their food. Okay, so that means if you take that 1,000 acres, they may use 500 of those acres. A single tiger, for example, may go across that whole area in a week just to find it's enough prey to feed it. And so consequently, you put that barrier up there, you've really cut its food supply almost in half. Then, of course, if it's a road, what also do you think is going to have a big impact on these predators? Well, what do you think will be killing? For example, this is the main thing that killed Florida panthers. Yeah, car impact, absolutely. Get hit by cars. So that's a problem.
You said pandas?
No, panthers, Florida panthers, yeah.
Makes more sense.
I mean, they could have been. They're pretty slow, so I imagine you see them a little bit better. But
Exactly.
so anyway, top level consumers, top level predators are particularly affected by fragmentation. Okay. Also, well, one potential help to this, one thing that works somewhat, are things called wilderness corridors. And as a matter of fact, we've got one pretty close to here. Anybody know what I'm talking about? Tyler, do you know? You looking it up? Nope. Get off your phone, please. You guys shouldn't even have my address. So why don't you clear out? We're gonna be much more strict on that through the. This is boot camp, by the way, because we're heading for review. So anybody ever go west on 46 from Sanford to Mount Dora?
Yeah.
Everybody drive that. You notice how as you drive along, all of a sudden there'll be those big tall fences on the side, and then there'll be a little break, and go a little hump, and then the fences come back. Do you know what that is?
No. That you just said.
So, well, more than that than what I just said. What is? Yeah, Lauren? It's a wilderness corridor, sure, yeah.
A tunnel that goes over the highway?
Well, not over.
Or under it?
Yeah. Tunnel under the highway, correct. For what?
For bears?
Primarily bears. Now, bears actually made enough of a comeback that they're kind of becoming a problem. They just recently, this was the first year they had a bear hunt. But when that was built, they're still, I don't know. I don't know if they're considered threatened now. If you have hunts for threatened animals, I don't have to check into that. But they were threatened at one point, threatened population, the Florida black bear, and that is the prime habitat for that organism. And one of the main things that was killing it was crossing Highway 46. It's a long 2-lane road, and the people are going 55. And so that was a common way in which the bears were killed. So what that is, it is a tunnel. And now the fences are there, so they don't go across the road, and they eventually get to the point where there's that tunnel underground. They can cross under that tunnel and make it to the other side. Because the bear instead of going over the mountain, the bear went under the road. Yeah, Caroline.
Is it true that in Germany they have kind of like those, but they're Passovers and it's like made with grass?
Thank you, Caroline, for pointing that out. I was just going to mention that.
Yes.
What they have found, and it's not just Germany, but they have one of the directions they're going more so with this now is rather than tunnels under the road, making basically an overpass where the cars go in a tunnel under, it's a land bridge basically. And so on that bridge that's over the road is woods and trees and grass and everything else like that. So to the bear, whatever's being protected, it's more or less, they don't know the difference. It's kind of hard to get a bear through the tunnels, especially the big ones. You got to get behind them and push them through, and everything. No, they're bigger than that. But it's not a natural structure for them, so it does take a little while before they get used to using it. So that limits it a little bit, but the corridor overpasses,
Really
wilderness,
cool
overpasses are actually a more effective way to do that. So those help, but you're still going to get bears. You still get bears get hit by cars and stuff because they don't use it or they get on before the fence goes up and whatever else. And so complete preservation is ideal in that respect. There are areas. So we're clear on fragmentation, right? Anybody have any questions about it? Okay. So ecologists have established around the world certain areas where both the biodiversity is high and species, there's a large number of species in those areas that are particularly under threat. From what? Well, whatever. From development, threat from climate change, like islands, threat from pollution. So these areas, like I said, they've been established. They are called biodiversity hotspots, and they just give ecologists, conservation biologists areas to focus on and devote their efforts. Of course, these will be, like I said, the Nature Conservancy goes around buying things. They will, in particular, buy plots of land and stuff in these areas. And so that's what a biodiversity hotspot is. And I'll show you a map in a second, which you just saw actually, because I bumped the mouse, that shows you some of those. Any questions?